The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tonga and Peach Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamak, Sorano, Kauia, Peum Kuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai Tipai, Kumeyaay, and Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC History Department, we encourage you to visit their website. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, we'd love to know where you're watching from. I already asked you in the chat, but feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you'd like to know what Indigenous territory you're on, or you already know and you want to share that with us, please let us know that as well. And my colleague Maya is going to post a link in the chat where you can find out what Indigenous land or whose Indigenous land you're on. Remember, when you type in the chat, I'm going to just talk about Zoom protocols for a minute. There's an option between sharing your message with hosts and panelists and sharing your message with everybody. So maybe everyone would like to see where you're from. So my name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And on behalf of the center, I'm happy to welcome those of you in the room with us and those of you joining us online. For those of you online, we'll have time for questions and discussion. We encourage and invite lots of participation and questions and comments. For those of you on Zoom, you can ask your questions in the chat or by using the Q&A feature at the bottom. And if you feel so bold, you can ask your questions on audio by clicking the raise hand button. When you consider how to ask your question, just keep in mind that this lecture is being recorded and we plan to share it very widely. So if you have concerns about privacy, keep that in mind when you are asking your question. And my colleague Maya will help to read the questions from the Zoom for the sake of the recording. And of course, for those of you in person, we hope to have lots of lively discussion. So now to introduce today's lecturer and speaker, I'll introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, and Professor of History, Wolf Gruner.
So welcome everybody, and big thanks to Martha and Maya for the work to enable this lecture. First, a few words about the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Since its founding in 2014, the Center has concentrated its effort on developing innovative interdisciplinary programs and enabling international research on three distinct areas. One is focusing on resistance to genocide and mass violence, another on violence, emotion, and behavioral change. And then the last one is on digital genocide studies. The center manages a rich academic program. We are each year holding or co-organizing an international conference. We are hosting numerous scholars every semester from an international sphere with junior and senior fellowships the center holds. And as well, we are increasingly welcome visiting scholars who are using the resources USC is providing in Holocaust and genocide studies. We are also organizing workshops, a lecture series as this one, and offer other unique research opportunities. One of the fellowships which our center bestows is the Beth and Arthur Research Fellowship for student research. And this is focusing on undergraduates and graduate students here at the University of Southern California. And they are eligible at any academic level from any academic discipline. And the fellowship enables them to do 1 month of research and residency at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research by focusing on research with the survivor testimonies of the USC Shore Foundation Visual History Archive. But also using other resources we have amassed over the last decade at USC in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. To introduce our speaker, who is the Beth and Arthur Lev Student Research Fellowship holder of the last summer. And he is a 3-year PhD student at the Sociology department at USC, studying social movements and political sociology. He earned his MA, his master in Latin American and Caribbean studies, and his BA in sociology, Spanish, and global studies at New York University. He was born and raised in Guatemala City, and his current research looks at the mechanisms of mobilization that kind of emancipatory social movements use after periods of intense state-sanctioned violence. For his research, he already received the W.E.B.U. Boyce and Ida B. Wells Barnett Graduate Student Scholar Award. Before starting his PhD, Vaclav Masek served as a counselor in the Congressional Committee on Labor for the 9th Legislature of the Republic of Guatemala, with direct oversight on projects like the push for part-time labor and domestic workers' rights. He is very active in the public sphere, writing monthly op-eds in El Periódico, in one of the largest Spanish language newspapers in Guatemala. And before he did this, he also wrote monthly columns on CNN in Espanol, commenting on contemporary Central America. His public work has been published in various kind of venues focusing on Latin America and mostly in the Spanish language. In his academic career, he has also published already and co-published several articles during the recent years. For example, one article in the International Area Studies Review in 2021 with the title "Demand Without Supply, Mass Partisanship, Ideological Attachments, and the Puzzle of Guatemala's Electoral Market Failure." His article "La paradoja del desarrollo, consultas comunitarias en la posguerra guatemalteca" is forthcoming in the Ibero-American Journal of Development Studies this year. And he just shared with me, I didn't actually have everything here on my, because his kind of resume is already in his very early stage pretty impressive. And he just shared with me that he was invited to present at an international seminar in front of diplomats and other workers. What is it called? The Auschwitz seminar. So please welcome and congratulate him for his accomplishment so far. And he will share a little bit of his work with us now.
Thanks, Wolf, for the very kind introduction. Let's see if we can. Can you hear me fine on the? Yep. Is now better? Yeah. Good? Okay. Thanks for being here today, everyone. Today I have the opportunity to speak about a project that I have been working on for 15 months as part of my graduate training as a sociologist here at USC. I want to thank all of my colleagues and advisors who have provided very valuable feedback on my ethnographic research. And especially I wanted to thank the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at USC for graciously extending my lease and the office space that I overstayed for over a month now. This study begins with an emblematic case of indigenous activists in Guatemala organizing against environmental exploitation through anti-extractive movements. For decades, Maya Quechí communities living around Lake Izabal, the largest freshwater lake in Guatemala, have been mobilizing against the oldest mineral resource mine in the country. As you will see, the history of the Phoenix nickel mine is rife with violence. When a state-mediated community consultation was set to take place in late 2021, indigenous leadership alleged the government had purposely excluded them and their voices from participating in the deliberation process. So, while studies leads us to expect activists to avoid the difficult past as a site of trauma and struggle, I find that indigenous activists actually confront the past head-on. Through my ethnographic and archival methods, I illustrate how indigenous activists in Guatemala transform the complicated past by drawing on memories of victory and resilience in the face of struggle. Through this memory work, the problematic past can become a source of strength and power for coalition building, deploying a frame for an alternative imagined future. So my presentation starts today with a vignette from the field. Then I will present my empirical puzzle and review the sociological literature on collective memory and its relation to social movements, primarily through the prism of culture. I will discuss my methods and present some findings, combining elements from the field and the VHA collection. Most of the ethnographic data that I will share with you today has already been published in a Spanish language journal called Revista Iberoamericana de Estudios del Desarrollo in last December. And I am currently working on a new piece in English for peer review that incorporates the testimonies of genocide survivors. So if you want to read it, Mia will very graciously share the piece on the chat. So let's start. First, let's try to geolocate the site in the field. The oldest mineral mining project in my home country of Guatemala is called the Phoenix Mining Project, and it lays on the shore of Lake Izabal, as I mentioned. Short to it, very close by, is El Estor, which is a fishing village on the shores of the lake. And given the strategic position in the westernmost part of the country, the town in history served as a frontierland outpost for British merchants, thus getting its name, El Estor, an Hispanization of the store. So Lake Izabal, as being the outpost for British merchant and also the way to get into the Caribbean Sea, has been a very important place all along. So Don Cristobal, we're going to start in 2017. Don Cristobal Pop remembers very vividly when the water suddenly turned red. Indigenous Maya Quechí fishers depend on Lake Izabal for their livelihoods. So when the water changed color, Don Cristobal had just been elected president of the local Fishers Guild. It had a bad smell, he mentioned. There were rumors about whether the fish would be affected or not. The rust-colored patch of water stretched for more than a mile in front of the city. Raúl Tishash said, Cristobal said, our life is fishing, and we did not know what was going on. There were many rumors. So the Phoenix nickel mine, as I mentioned, is owned by a Switzerland-based company called Solway Investment Group, and is just 3 miles away from El Estor. So naturally, the Fishers Guild sought answers from the company given the environmental damage. We wanted things to be done transparently, said Don Raúl Tishash, recalling how he and others had urged the government to disclose water testings to the public. When that did not happen, Guild members began protesting the mine in May of 2017, and unfortunately, a Quechí fisherman named Carlos Mas was killed in the ensuing crackdown. So maybe some context would help provide some light over the anger, given the lack of corporate transparency. Under the government's approval, the Phoenix Mining Project's operating company had been extracting nickel illegally since 2005, failing to conduct a community consultation with local indigenous Maya Quechí communities as required under international labor law. So 2 years later, in 2019, following the extrajudicial murder of fisherman Carlos Mas, Guatemala's constitutional court ordered the mining company to carry out a free, prior, and informed consultation process as mandated by the International Labor Organization's 169th Convention on Indigenous Peoples and Native Nations, a human rights mandate that was ratified by the state of Guatemala as it transitioned into democracy. The mine defied the court order and continued illegally extracting the nickel. It operated illegally throughout 2020, even despite the lockdown during the pandemic. So when the legitimate community representatives were officially excluded from this community consultation process in October of 2021, they decided to take action again. They set up roadblocks protesting the mine, cutting off access to the processing plant, and many other indigenous organizations from across the Guatemalan geography started coming to El Estor to show their support. As we can see here in the picture below, this is the Maya Kekchi Ancestral Council gathering with the Xinca Parliament. So it's different ethnicities that are meeting here in support of this anti-extractive movement. When the state security apparatus descended on the peaceful resistance in this roadblock that lasted for 21 days, a lot of the people started mentioning the reasons why they were participating. For example, Angela says, I am here at the peaceful resistance for my children's future. If we continue to let the mining company trample over our territory illegally, we will lose everything we still have. We must not let them, the government, exclude us as they have done in the past. This is about democracy as much as our historical struggle. You might imagine what comes next. And the government responded very violently to the peaceful resistance at El Estor. After clearing the roadblocks with tear gas, the government declared a state of siege, limiting freedoms for 30 days and imposing nightly curfews. Around the town of El Estor, soldiers arrested supposed instigators. And as the images show here, officers from the National Civilian Police, the PNC, even guarded the mining trucks immediately after violently clearing out the peaceful resistance. So, under closed doors, the consultation process concludes, and the mining is set to resume again in 2022. So this is when I arrived at a puzzle. Social movement seems to be drawing on the past as a source of inspiration to persist in their organizing, even in the face of systematic exclusion from fully participating in democracy. So with this in mind, two of my research guiding questions arose. How does the relationship between collective memory and collective action manifest? And how do indigenous social movements articulate this intergenerational legacy of colonialism, genocide, and extraction? For this, let us turn to collective memory. What do I mean when I talk about collective memory? Collective memory encompasses shared frameworks that filter out individual and personal memories from sui generis representations of the past, including official text, commemorative ceremonies, and physical symbols such as monuments and memorials. I build on scholarship that asserts that collective memory has an instrumental purpose. Sociological work on collective memory actually originates with Emil Durkheim and his student Maurice Halbwachs. Although Durkheim really never used the term collective memory explicitly, he actually laid out the groundwork for this concept in his 1912 work, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And it was actually his student, Maurice Halbwachs, who introduced the term in the eponymous title on collective memory in 1925. He imbued this with theoretical meaning, referring not only to the collective representation that attracted Durkheim, but also to capture the social frameworks that shape memories, including even our most private dreams. So, collective memory is a pattern of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms through which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attitude toward life. So, from a communication standpoint, collective memory can be conceived in three different ways, although I'm sure this typology is insufficient. The first one is at a micro level. It is storytelling. Communication generates shared meaning and thus generates shared memory. It also can be communicated as shared experiences at a meso level. People of different generations apply different analogies to contemporaneous issues and may draw different conclusions on how to address them. Political attitudes, as we know, shape generational cohorts. And also, collective memory can be instrumentalized as social practice at a macro level. Memory emerges in social rituals, as we know, like commemoration, But there's also a physical embodiment of cultural memory that is essential for collective memory to arise. So collective memory is an analytical category that intersects these three different affective registers. For example, as this quote reads from the Peaceful Resistance in El Estor, no more discrimination, no more threats, no more forced evictions. Us, indigenous peoples, have opened up our eyes. We are no longer in the before times. So this self-placing in history and thinking about the past to actually mobilize into the future. Social movement scholars argue that activists use stories to mobilize participants, to enlist supporters, to influence decision makers, but their stories are only sometimes effective in doing those things. Understanding collective memories as shared ideas about the past, which provide a framework for interpreting the present, social movements can rely on memory to provide the legitimacy and identity that comes with that continuity with the past. And in cultural sociology, there's two main strands of literature that impact in a way, and it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. Social movements impact memory. It's very clear. It seems like grassroots organizing contributes to the way that we commemorate things. And in order for the past to be meaningful, memorialization must be present in our life. The second strand of literature is the other way around. It is that memory impacts social movements. So as the previous quote showed, the before times imply, in a sense, in Guatemala, a dormant civil society that allows for this type of impunity to run rampant. The identity of social movements typically rely on these symbols and narratives, including the ones about the movement itself in the political context. So in a way, the two strands of literature seem to agree that social movements gain legitimacy when they resonate or challenge mnemonic frames. In another word, memory can mobilize, and movements can reflectively bring about the past as a resourceful instrument. Again, I draw from multiple literatures to arrive to my findings and my theoretical contribution. And particularly, in order to concert strategic action into the future, I draw on what Bolivian anthropologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui calls the long memory of the peoples. Interpreting these historical events as different iterations of the same settler colonial project of displacement and dispossession, indigenous activists can position themselves in the historical struggle for self-determination, political autonomy, and epistemic justice that has been ongoing for 500 years. And as the opening vignette showed us, resistance against state-sponsored capitalist extractivism in Latin America has been invigorated by a multi-scalar alliance of indigenous and environmental movements enacting new forms of democratic participation, for example, through the community consultation. So in short, I locate my field in drawing from these multiple literatures, and now let me tell you a little bit about the methods that I used. So as I mentioned, my project combines ethnographic and archival fieldwork. My intervention actually began in the summer of 2021 when the state of Guatemala was convening representatives for this court-mandated community consultation over the operations of the Phoenix nickel mine. I carried out a field visit to El Estor to begin participant observation work with the Defensoría Quechí, which is a justice program for the Asociación Estoreña para el Desarrollo Integral, which is a land rights group drawing on United Nations treaties like Convention 169, in order to protect indigenous communities against these multinational corporations and other type of extractive threats. As a native Guatemalan and a foreign researcher, I joined the Defensoria's campaigning efforts to document whether these rights were enforced or not. This civil society group sees itself organizing the Maya Quechí communities in the Polo Chic River Valley, which is the larger Izabal region where El Estor is, into a unified front to help residents gain legal ownership of their own land. The Defensoría also seeks to implement local-level public policy measures that protect communities from pollution, discrimination, and that type of political motivated violence that they have suffered in the past. Upon returning to USC to continue my doctoral program, I kept in touch with the Defensoría. I kept close contact through video conference and direct messaging applications through an encrypted system. I was able to access their biweekly meetings with the Defensoría. And on top of that, I was able to interview the team and other people that participating during the peaceful resistance. One more thing about this. I did not start searching for indications of political exclusion of indigenous communities. Instead, I was interested in these democratic mechanisms that aim to expand enfranchisement, like the community consultations. What I found inductively was that the participants' stories and words led them to reflect the violent effects of current governing practices and domestic law on their lives. Study participants described their legally rooted circumstances in terms that evoke the suffering and resilience associated with more obvious and direct forms of violence, such as those that we experienced during war. For example, pain, torture, sadness, anguish. Yes. Oh, and one thing here that I forgot to mention. During the height of the repression, when the state of siege was mandated and essentially the town of El Estor was occupied by the military, I was able to serve as a crowdfunding manager, which is what you see over there. I launched a GoFundMe campaign to help defray the Defensoría's costs of not being able to go into the offices given the dangerously militarized context. And the results were overwhelmingly positive. The raised funds, which were over $4,000, supported the continuing programming of community radios in Quechua that were actually covering the events during the crackdown. So this international show of solidarity was actually came as a precious lifeline to the organization. So now to the VHA. As a left fellow, I spent a month immersed in the visual history archive here at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, based here on campus at USC. I investigated the testimonies of genocide survivors in Guatemala to decipher the articulations of intergenerational resistance that have woven these robust networks of solidarity throughout our country's turbulent history. It is very reasonable to ask how any population can overcome the experience of an orchestrated campaign of extermination when simply remembering the past can be traumatizing. How can such moments even be commemorated productively to the extent that they can even present an opportunity for a cathartic reappraisal on behalf of the survivors? Well, compiled between 2014 and 2016 to the Herculean effort of the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation, the FAFGE, and the Shoah Foundation, the 20 testimonies that I have observed reveal how collective memory is the mechanism that impacts social justice movements in Guatemala. In these sensitive testimonies, past events cease to be the disjointed individual memories and become contextualized collective memories when they are translated into joint civil action. I listened to a cumulative of 50 hours of indexed testimonies in Spanish, which allowed me to transcribe, code, and look for patterns in the discursive elements of their recollections. The framing of the struggle for a transitional justice from below reaches far back into the past, but reverberates very vividly in the present. As I will reveal in my findings very shortly, just as grassroots activism in El Estor continued to condemn the environmental exploitation in the wake of criminalization, genocide survivors dedicate their lives to the recovery of historical memory in a civil society context depleted of human rights and with a very weak rule of law. In short, the VHA testimonies show resiliency as a characteristic of subjects facing political violence in Guatemala across historical periods. What I found is that indigenous resistance is the most enduring feature across Guatemalan history. Moreover, I kept the cause running and in the public sphere by producing publicly accessible knowledge of the struggle in El Estor, and in my research here at the VHA, both in Spanish and in English. Here are some opinion editorials that I was able to publish in El Periódico throughout my investigation. And I think this is also important to mention that speaks about my position as a participant observer, but with clearly a mindset of a scholar and an activist. As the project unfolded and I bore witness to the multiple illegalities the Quechua were subjected to, I became a firm believer of the causes that they were defending. I thought they were just. So my public-facing writing aimed to raise awareness, but also to condemn the government's brutality. And now to the fun part. Here I want to talk a little bit about temporal imaginations. And it's a concept that I coined in my last article, which Mia shared on the chat for those of us in Zoom. And I also want a trigger warning for violence in the following slides, given that we will be talking about the Guatemalan genocide. So let's zoom back into the mine. Why is this mine such an iconic and emblematic and infamous place in Guatemala? Well, it has been the source of land and social conflict for nearly 60 years. And it was originally known as the Exmival mine, and it started when a Canadian international nickel company became the subsidiary after gaining the land lease from military governments. It was the beginning of the Guatemalan armed conflict that later evolved into the genocide. They extended the lease, the military dictatorship, to INCO, to this Canadian company, for 40 years. And of course, this land was in Quechua Maya territory, and the project involved the dispossession of communities in an aid to accumulate for the extractive industry. As the Guatemalan armed conflict started to intensify in the 1970s, the mining project actually struggled to initiate extractive operations. So when the National University, the Universidad de San Carlos, assembled a commission sent to study the environmental impacts of the mine, many of this resulted in injuries of the people that were investigating, death, and exile. But as the violence continued, one peak was the Panzos massacre in 1978. For those of us who have studied the Guatemalan genocide, many think of this as the tipping point. Maya Quechua peasants were protesting against abuses by this multinational corporation, and the army brutally quelled this protest by shooting into crowds, killing at least 53 people, among them many women and children. Most of the corpses were buried in a common grave in an attempt from the army to disappear the material evidence, and even days after the massacre, several dozen bodies were seen alongside the Polchik River and even Lake Izabal. As the guerrilla activity increased in the region, a lot of counterinsurgency campaigns started to be implemented by the state, and the Historical Clarification Commission actually has stories of state forces or masked men using INCO vehicles, using the mining company vehicles to disappear people. So after the 1996 peace accords, and we have a new post-war neoliberal reform consensus from the government, the mine changed hands, and it went from a Canadian company to another Canadian company, and then another Canadian company, and finally to the company that it is currently operating, which is Russian-funded, Swiss-based. So as we see, it's a very contentious place in Guatemala. So what I found is that knowing now the history and geography of this place, I claim that collective memory is mobilized through this concept I am calling temporal imaginations, which are narrative reconstructions of how social movements imagine themselves in history and position themselves in time. In Guatemala, there are 4 broad historical periods of genocidal violence against indigenous peoples, and they are reconstructed narratively as an amalgamating force in the mobilization efforts. The first one is the colonization era, from the 16th century to the independence of Guatemala from the Spanish Empire. The second one is the development of a plantation economy between the 19th century and the US-backed coup d'etat against a democratically elected government in 1954. The third one is the military dictatorships that culminated in genocide in the second half of the 20th century. And finally, this era that we're now, multinational extractive practices in the backdrop of neoliberal reform. So again, temporal imaginations are these mnemonic frames that situate the social movement in this long historical struggle, and also aims to mobilize more people to gain adherence. So when we pay close attention to the stories of the Maya Quechua residents of El Estor used to mobilize people, we encounter narratives rooted in the collective memory of triumph and dignified resistance. Using the framework of settler colonialism shows that the land grab of Maya territories initiated by the Spanish colonizers actually never really ceased. It evolved, and it was perpetuated in times of war and peace. The stealing of Maya ancestral lands is not a historical episode linked to the Spanish invasion, but rather a defining structure of Guatemala's modern nation state. The testimonies of genocide survivor, which I will be showing shortly, also add unparalleled analytical leverage to this theoretical proposition. Memory must be understood as an exercise to document data and a valuable process for the praxis of communities affected by violence. Remembering the brutality serves to typify mass atrocities and prevent their repetition in the future. Let's go into the field again. What do temporal imaginations look like? What do they sound like? How are they framed? For example, this is from Angela, a Maya Kikchi woman who was participating in the peaceful process in El Estor, and she referred to the colonization process. For example, she said, the Guatemalan state's colonial logic subjects us to second-class citizen status because our opinions do not matter, even if the issues concern our livelihoods. I also found temporal imaginations alluding to colonization and to the longer story of different iterative settler colonial practices in the VHA. This is Domingo Gomez Icoy. He's a Kikchi genocide survivor whose first memories growing up is being displaced by a series of settlers. Narrating a part of his biography where he is explaining to the interviewer the finca situation or the plantation situation in the Poluchic River Valley, Domingo says, the Spanish divided the lands of the ancestors, the Germans bought the land, displaced us, and stayed there, and now it's the military who administered it. I will be showing this video. Just a quick note, it's in Spanish, but pretty much it's just a couple of minutes, so bear with me.
Decir un poquitillo más atrás, ¿verdad? Por lo que cuentan los compañeros y después lo que yo vi, ¿verdad? Estas tierras, ¿verdad? Fueron de los alemanes. Pero antes de los alemanes, ya los españoles, ¿verdad? Fueron a dividir las tierras de nuestros ancestros. Enseguida de esto llegaron los alemanes. Los alemanes llegaron a tomar las tierras y se dividieron las tierras, vendieron algunos y de ahí ellos se quedaron ahí. Hasta fue en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, ¿verdad? En el año 44, 47, fue cuando se fueron los alemanes de aquí de Guatemala, las tierras fueron dejadas. Estas tierras no eran de nadie, ¿eh? Los alemanes les tomaron las tierras. Pero ya después, cuando se fueron los alemanes, ¿qué es lo que hizo el propio gobierno? Lo vuelve a tomar otra de esas tierras. En vez de que las tierras fueran entregadas hacia nuestros abuelos, hacia nuestras abuelas, hacia nuestras madres. En ese entonces, mi madre pues era pequeña todavía. ¿Qué fue lo que sucedió con el gobierno? Vuelve a tomar las tierras. Se inscribe a nombre de la nación. Lo inscribe a nombre de la nación. No devuelve las tierras a los campesinos. Entonces de ahí, cuando fue tomada las tierras de Chicoyahuito de nuevo, llegaron los administradores. ¿Quiénes eran los administradores? Los mismos militares, así como comandantes, coroneles, ¿verdad? Jefes de Estado. Ellos son los que administraron esa finca después de que se fueron los alemanes. Entonces ya...
So, let's do a quick analysis of what Domingo was saying here. Placing them sequentially, Domingo explains later in the interview that the treatment of Kikchi communities that they have been subjected to actually is cyclical, right? The comment also reveals that colonization and coffee capitalism are two different things. He talks about the Spanish and then he talks about the Germans. So this supports the framework that I showed earlier, right? There's different waves, different cycles, but ultimately the losers are always the Maya Kikchi communities. Back to El Estor. Violence seems to trigger different temporal landscapes, which serves a purpose in social movements. But also violence is a constant feature in the indigenous life world. For example, in El Estor, the intergenerational legacy of struggle is an element in discursive action during the state of siege, after the state security forces, as you can see in the image, descended on the town. So Macloni, the director of the Defensoría Kikchi, was actually narrating his survival against this counterinsurgent campaign in the 80s as reminiscent of what was going on back in October of 2021. He said, seeing soldiers patrolling the street brings you back to the years of conflict violence. Now, under a state of siege and with a curfew, militarization is intimidating. We distrust our intentions because of the legacy of these types of actions. So imagine being able to put yourself back in the years of counterinsurgency violence by seeing what is going on in the present. Let's move to how temporal imaginations make allusions to the genocide. This is Emma Molina-Thyssen. If anyone has ever heard about transitional justice in Guatemala, perhaps you've heard about this name. If not, I'll give you a short description on who she is. In 2018, a special high-risk Guatemalan court condemned 4 high-ranking military officials to 58 years in prison for their involvement in crimes against humanity and aggravated sexual assault against Ms. Molina-Thyssen, and the forced disappearance of her 14-year-old brother, Marco Antonio Molina-Thyssen. These crimes took place in 1981, at the height of the internal armed conflict, which, by the way, left 200,000 people dead and 45,000 disappeared, including an estimated 5,000 children. They were one of the first cases to be brought to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. It was a huge breakthrough for Guatemala, and it vindicated the family's long search for justice. So Emma's testimony, which is at the VHA, reveals where she gained the courage to speak out against traumatic violence. And it's the Kikchi women who survived the sexual violence in Sepur Sarco. So she says, for me, seeing the women of Sepur Sarco was healing. Sepur Sarco was a horrible case during the war where indigenous Kikchi women, most of them underage, were used as sexual slaves in a military outpost close to El Estor. I have realized that I have to get to have the strength of those ladies without feeling shame, disgust, or guilt. With their testimony, voice, and brilliance with which they expose the situation in Guatemala, they are the hope that continues to push me forward. So we're going to listen to this in Spanish.
Este juicio, la justicia que se está abriendo paso, por más tortuoso que sea el camino, por más lento que sea, ha ido haciendo posible que nosotras como familia nos sintamos unidas en esta búsqueda, en esta lucha. Y es así como yo me incorporo de nuevo a volver a hablar, a volver a... Yo he dado testimonios legales, he presentado pruebas, he hecho de todo, pero ha sido en medio de una fragilidad emocional muy, muy limitante de mi capacidad para transmitir lo que yo ahora puedo transmitir. A mí el juicio me ha fortalecido. Estuve en Washington en abril. Me llevaron las compañeras de acá de Guatemala, de la Convergencia, para ir a hacer pues trabajo de lobby, presentar el caso ante la comisión, presentar cómo está el juicio. Y para mí fue especialmente sanador saber de la experiencia de las señoras de Sepur Sarco. Esas mujeres a mí me cambiaron el corazón. Y ver tantas muchachas jóvenes como usted, haciendo tanto, queriendo hacer tanto por Guatemala, a mí me hizo ver dos cosas. Primero, que yo tengo que llegar a tener algún día la fuerza de las señoras de Sepur Sarco. Tengo que llegar a hablar de lo que me pasó, con la capacidad de transmitirlo sin sentir la vergüenza, el asco y la culpa que me provoca. Y tener también la capacidad de reconocerlas a ustedes como personas que me están dando una esperanza para Guatemala.
The Thyssen testimony also reveals that activists can use memory to make appeals against the last stage of genocide, which is forgetting. This is Ana Lucrecia Molina Thyssen, the sister of Emma, and here she is addressing a group of young Guatemalans in the rural part of the country. She says, "You are the future of this country. Do not let this repeat again. Our society still has a lot of pain and violence, but that can change. Get involved, educated, participate. We have never quit despite the challenges. Can you imagine 45,000 people disappeared, among which 5,000 children? This disappeared should not be forgotten, because that is to kill them definitely. It is to allow these savages events to continue in our society." I won't show this video because of time constraints. Finally, the third sort of invasion that indigenous peoples use to frame their social movement is extractivism. For example, Martín, during the peaceful resistance in El Estor in October of 2021, he mentions, "How is it possible that they, the government, unload all the public security apparatus to repress us in the name of an international mining company? It demonstrates that they seek the resources, that they prefer the mining profits." And the BHA was actually extremely useful for me to think about extractivism not only as an incident happening now, but also a process of settler colonialism that has been ongoing for a longer time. The BHA has this fantastic tool where you can actually click and draw around the map, and it will pop up all the indexed terms that have been mentioned in any of the testimonies in the collection. So for example, this is a map of the Polochic River Valley, and these are all the places that are mentioned in these testimonies. And this reaffirms the idea of the importance of El Estor, right? It was a trading post for cargo, a lot of travelers went by, it's close to Coban, which was a huge center for coffee during the 19th century. It had a navigable river routes through the Polochic that led you to Panzós. Panzós, the place of horrible violence. And it's also close to Puerto Barrios, which is the largest Caribbean seaport in Guatemala. This is the testimony of Nicolás Tista. After surviving torture at a military outpost, he was released and he had to find a job. And he became a public health worker, and he fumigated homes in around the Polochic River Valley. Malaria and dengue are big concerns in these lowlands. So in a way, we can think about Nicolás having this incredible access across the isolated communities in the Polochic River Valley. He remembers visiting El Estor, Panzós, and Playa Grande, and witnessing horrible sights, as he says over here. "I saw so much death in Playa Grande and El Estor and Panzós. We would find bodies scattered across the mountains. Still, we could not speak because we were afraid. When I got to Panzós, there was nothing there. But there, so much blood was spilled. I fled to Alta Verapaz after this." We'll just listen to the way that he says it because I think it's really powerful.
¿De qué encuentra trabajo y en qué época encuentras trabajo nuevamente?
Pues yo, gracias a Dios que solicité mi trabajo en salud, en malaria.
Ministerio de Salud de
Exacto, sí. Entonces me dieron trabajo, trabajé.
¿De qué trabajaba usted?
Yo estoy fumigando casas. Yo fumigaba las casas en las comunidades, por comunidades. Conocí muchas comunidades. Salió mi plaza en Fray y ahí me mandaron a Cantabal, Playa Grande.
¿Cómo fue la vida allá en Cantabal o qué cosas le tocó ver a usted?
En aquel tiempo era muy duro.
¿Qué año fue eso?
En el 82 fue eso. En el 82 fue, entonces había mucho problema. En las comunidades no podía uno entrar. Pero nosotros de malaria, con la medicina, por combatir el paludismo, ahí sí nos dejaban entrar.
¿Qué cosas le tocó ver a usted ahí en Playa Grande, Xcán?
En Playa Grande vi muchos muertos, tiradas por todas las montañas.
¿Vio de cerca algún enfrentamiento o solamente...?
No, yo solo vi que estaban tirados, muertos. Pero ninguno podía dar información. Ni nos preguntaban que si vimos algo, no. Nosotros nos daban porque teníamos miedo.
Ustedes, como parte del Ministerio de Salud, les tocaba visitar las casas de las
Exacto.
personas en las comunidades.
Así es.
¿Cuánto tiempo estuvo ahí en Playa Grande?
Yo un año estuve trabajando ahí. De ahí me mandaron al store. Del store trabajé 6 meses. De ahí me mandaron a Panzós. De Panzós ahí trabajé 4 años.
¿Cómo vivió Panzós? ¿Qué cosas le tocó ver en Panzós?
Ya
en esa
entonces en
época?
aquel tiempo cuando yo llegué ahí ya no había tanto problema.
Ya había terminado.
Ya se había pasado el problema porque ahí sí corrió sangre.
Sí. ¿Y cómo se vivía el ambiente hacía unos 2 o 3 años que había pasado?
He says, ahí corrió mucha sangre. There's a lot of blood that was spilled there. So going back to the anti-extractive movements, here we see at the forefront Ms. Rosalina Tuyuk, who is a genocide survivor, and she is out here condemning, with a group of other indigenous women, the illegalities that the mining company carried out in El Estor. And urban social movements are also incorporating their own claims and their own demands and their own framings into this situation. And you can see that the word ecocide is now being related to what happened in El Estor. So this relationship between genocide and ecocide, and whether both of them are mutually constituted of state-sanctioned violence, I think is an interesting thing to continue following. I wanted to give you a little bit of an update with what's going on with the folks in the Defensoría Quechí in El Estor, and from a press conference that I was able to attend at the end of 2021. And this is the team, and this is what they said. We will take this case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The state of Guatemala would rather see a foreign multinational dilapidate our land instead of offering a seat at the negotiating table. They would much rather undercut us, our movement, than acknowledge us. They can spend all the money they want on sabotaging us, but a bullet would be cheaper. We won't back down because the alternative is also death. And a quick addendum to the vignette that I showed you at the beginning. The resistance made international headline news because of how brutal it was and how egregious the political violence was. And journalism started looking into the company, and they found that first, on June 2022 of last year, that the mining concession was actually hiding the pollution in the lake. Shortly thereafter, the US got involved, this Treasury Department, and it sanctioned the mining company. And at the end of last year, in December, the mining company stopped. They stopped operating. There's no more extraction happening in El Estor currently. Now, some closing remarks. As a discipline, sociology equips us with the tools to discern structures at work. In the case of El Estor, we see how collective memory mobilizes against these toxic narratives deployed against indigenous social movements. For example, here, before the crackdown on dissent and when folks were just blocking the mine during the peaceful resistance, I asked them, what do you think when people and journalists and conservative commentators say that you're actually blocking development? This is what Martín from the Defensoría told me. When people say that the indigenous communities are blocking the roads, we say, no, we have been mobilizing for a dignified life where we can have profound political changes in the way our country is organized. Those who have been blocking the road towards a dignified life are the criminal elites who refuse to make structural changes and cling to power through the Guatemalan state. I think it's also important to reflect that by sharing a testimony, a new political consciousness is born, reconstructing a narrative that resignifies a traumatizing past. While the old consciousness has a way of making sense of things, a new consciousness rearranges things into a new theory or new story. Its different reverberations between events may be misled after earlier assumptions. For example, an old conscience can understand the disappearance of a loved one as perhaps a defensible state action against a dangerous subversive, where in contrast, a new conscience resignifies it as a profound injustice that must be resisted tooth and nail. A nation consciousness can read the quintessential of Columbus as a celebration of civilization against barbarism or the blending of two cultures, whereas in contrast, the new emerging Maya consciousness will make sense of it as 500 years of trauma that must be addressed through the emergence of a healthy body politic. To close up, I want to show what Candelaria Tun Iko, who was interviewed in Kikchi territory, said when the interviewer asked her, how do you keep going after all the things that you experienced, the sexual violence, the torture, the disappearance of your family members, losing your kids? She said, to keep going, I must keep the faith, trust, and communication with the organizations helping me recover my forgotten story. I can't lose my history. I have to practice this. I need to share with other people so that they learn about the reality of what we went through. To recover, we must share these stories widely. Young people must listen to and get to know these testimonies, respect them and embrace them. This must not be repeated, killings, massacres, and we must educate ourselves. So I'll leave this in Spanish and for the folks on Zoom.
Después de todo lo que usted vivió durante principalmente esos 4 años, después de perder a su esposo, tener que huir a la montaña y tener que sufrir todas las condiciones y regresar acá, ¿qué es lo que a usted le ha dado fuerzas para seguir, además de viviendo, luchando por que otras personas puedan recuperar su historia y puedan vivir mejor?
Pues para mí, para seguirme en adelante, tengo que tener confianza y tengo que tener comunicación con las organizaciones para seguir en adelante. Yo no puedo perder mi lucha ni perder mi historia. Lo tengo que poner en práctica y lo tengo que compartir a otras personas para que lo conozcan también, para que lo sepan la realidad, que es lo que habíamos pasado. Y dónde tenemos que recuperarnos y cómo para recuperarnos y cómo para compartir esta historia. Yo quisiera que los jóvenes que conozcan también cuál es la realidad y cuál es lo que afecta más en la vida. Lo que afecta más es cuando uno no lo escucha, no lo respetan, no tienen disciplina. Por eso yo siempre me comparto con las organizaciones a recibir orientaciones a otra persona para compartir. Así me siento tranquila, me siento todo lo que me había pasado. Siempre lo dejo en otro lado, pero a veces me recuerda porque no puedo olvidar también. Todavía lo que había pasado, me recuerdo todo. Por eso los que están creciendo, que lo escuchen, que lo respeten también lo que habíamos pasado, para que ya no se vuelva otra vez la matanza, la masacre, que ponga a estudiar, que ponga a buscar trabajos para salir adelante. Porque sin trabajo uno no puede vivir también. Allí se empiezan problemas en la vida de uno. Cuando uno tiene la capacitación o tiene la capacidad de trabajar, siempre no se buscan problemas en la vida, no tienen una meta de dónde ir, de dónde trabajar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vaclav. Can you stop sharing
Yes.
for the purpose of the Q&A? So now we invite your questions and comments, and on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature or put them in the chat or raise your hand. Please.
Thank you, Vaclav, for sharing your research with us. I found it very fascinating and very important, and I really appreciated how you talked about how your positionality was really, really important in thinking about, why you wanted to do this research, but also the importance of incorporating research and thinkers from Latin America and Guatemala. So thank you for doing that. I felt very inspired. My question is, so you brought up temporal imaginations, which is really exciting to think about. So how would you kind of extend it broader, right? Like, how can temporal imaginations help us to understand your case, but also other cases related to power over vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think as a framework, it helps us to think a new way of the framing literature in social movements, the way that you articulate the ideas behind why other people should join your cause. And I think by grounding it in very concrete historical moments where there was perhaps a rupture in the social fabric, and this movement was, combating for, say, more equitable pay or more equal civil rights. And they make a direct reference verbally during that framing. I think you can start to incorporate the ideas of other social movements around the world. I think the issue with the Guatemala research can be definitely amplified for Latin America. I reckon perhaps indigenous resistance against extractivism as a conceptual sort of element of temporal imaginations is very easy to apply because you can think about settler colonialism in these different iterations that I mentioned, for example, colonization, plantation economies, this very explicit moment of state-sanctioned violence, and now state-sanctioned multinational extractivism as these very concrete historical groundings for this framing. So I think it could be incorporated for other social movements that have, a legacy of organizing. And I think it's important to apply it because normally these social movements are not theorized as successful, right? It is a very problematic thing to think that, the genocide wiped out Mayan populations, so indigeneity in Guatemala has been sort of fabricated afterwards. It's not true. Temporal imaginations actually gives you a framework to think how it has evolved over time and how it's resisted over time. So yeah, I definitely push everyone to use it in their own research.
Yeah, thank you. I learned a lot about this, which I didn't know a lot about, but I heard about similar, practices. I think you did a very good job highlighting the testimonies and the memory of the people. I'm just curious if you thought about including more identifiers and maybe even what the actual government, who the government leaders were and how they justified it, and also maybe who some of the CEOs are of these companies. And like, for example, I'm Canadian, and I didn't know that about that Canadian history, but I'm actually not surprised because Canada has a lot of mining companies. But here, or Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, current Prime Minister, maybe him or a representative that could offer some sort of explanation of why that was approved. And I think that would be great. And maybe, really, I'm just curious if you thought about any of this part of the story, and also maybe the universities that support and invest in these companies.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a very fair point. One of the actual criticisms that I've gotten is that I don't give space to companies and to the state to sort of articulate their own way of approaching the issue of this mining practice. And I always say that's not the point, right? Like, I am centering the indigenous social movement here to produce, a different type of epistemology. But definitely, I mean, to be able to understand the way that corporations and governments are essentially, colluding against communities is massively important. And Canada I mean, is a mining juggernaut and has operations across the world, and Canadians are not necessarily aware of the impact that it has environmentally, socially, economically. So part of the purpose of now doing an English piece is to shed more light and raise awareness that, you know, this very friendly, diplomatic image of a Canadian and, you know, that is, you know, happy-go-lucky maple syrup type of person is not really the case for corporations. And they are, in fact, pardon the expression, but getting in bed with really dangerous actors, very corrupt governments who are building the entire political infrastructure on the bodies of Indigenous people, right? And I know that Canada is currently undergoing a decolonial experience on its own. So I'm excited to hear what type of reception this type of work gets, because it's, again, sort of pointing the mirror against a community that has been normally accepted as good and generous and like they have their hands clean, when in reality, once you start following the thread, it goes back to 60 years.
I have a comment and then I have a question from two folks in the chat. I have a comment from Jackie Kuma. Thank you. I'm Indigenous in Canada, and the Ring of Fire is speeding up despite Indigenous people's rhetoric on the treaty talks like water concerns, etc. Both the governments don't appear to listen. And then Maria Firmino Castillo says, thank you for sharing your important research and your manner of working in solidarity with the communities that you're engaged with. The framework of temporal imagination is really compelling and helpful for my own research, and I look forward to studying your work. I'd like to hear more how you define quote-unquote imagination, and especially how to employ such a term without becoming vulnerable to genocide denialist claims that testimonies and survivor claims are fabricated. I'm thinking of, for example, the work of David Stoll, but also others.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of denial, right? Memory. Memory is, from a very political point of view, a counter-hegemonic act of political resistance, in my view. So, yeah, Guatemala, unfortunately, because of the work of scholars like David Stoll, has a culture of denial against what happened against Mayan communities in the Western Highlands and in the Bolechic River Valley. So it's really hard to do this type of research, understanding that sort of environmentally, the public discourse would subvert my claims by saying that there was no genocide. So how would they even, begin to address the root causes of inequality when, the state was defending us against subversion from insurgents? It is hard. It is hard work, but ultimately, an exciting part of this project, also with the VHA, is that there are many, many more testimonies that we still haven't heard. The collection currently has 32 testimonies that have been processed and indexed, some of which are in Quiché, but there are over 400 testimonies that we haven't heard and we haven't indexed and haven't seen sort of public light. And I think that's where we can contribute as academics and activists, bringing this work into light. As the last survivor told us in my last slide, people need to know. And that's how you tackle denial, with more information, with more testimonies, with more people having the courage to step up and tell their harrowing tale of survival, because ultimately it will bring more people together. And that's the idea of temporal imaginations. You can use memory to mobilize people.
Hi, thank you for coming to share your research. I guess in the vein of memory and sort of a little empathy that we're finding through these stories, what would you say is for people who are finding these testimonies and experiencing the knowledge of this for the first time, as well as the experience of of knowledge of similar things, of other examples of genocide and state-sanctioned terror globally, what would be a tangible next step for them beyond spreading the word and knowing, because there is not a lot of examples of that for other cases and in this case, and for a lot of people it kind of just stops there in terms of what they feel like they can do.
Yeah, totally. I think if concrete action items are necessary, is going back to these 400 testimonies that people have still not heard and processed before. We need people that speak Spanish and understand Spanish and other indigenous languages to go through these testimonies, many of which are 2-3 hours, and index them in order to be able to show them to the rest of the people. In a way, there's a lot of archival work that still needs to be done. There's a lot of processing that still needs to be done. And in order to do that, you need to meet certain criteria, right? You need to be contextualized with the Guatemalan history. So when you're hearing these testimonies, you know the places that they're mentioning, the presidents that they're mentioning, the references in the sort of colloquial jargon that they use. You need to speak Spanish, right? Or Quiche or Quechua. And you need to be willing to sit down and listen to the most harrowing stories. And that takes a lot of courage as well. You need to, endure a lot of pain. And the empathy that you need to have to process these testimonies are a huge contribution. Being able to sit down and listen to these stories and just take it in, that's an action item that is going to take, at least for me, when I started listening to the testimonies, it took a while. It was really hard. I had to stop many times because I was either on the verge of tears or extremely upset. And, this is not for everyone. This is the path that I chose to follow, but there's not many of us, right? There's not many people dedicating their doctoral training to listening to 50 plus hours of stories about war. That is an action item that you could perhaps try to do, like go into the archives and start scouring through the documents and pick and choose. You're ultimately a curator. You're going to show videos that people might find interesting or not. So your own sort of positionality as someone in the US with an affiliation with a private university is already a step really far ahead. So yeah, acting upon the privilege that we are granted by being able to access these things without the fear of persecution, right? This work in Guatemala could not occur that easily. So I am acting on my privilege of being able to be here and do this work in a beautiful LA winter,
Thank you so much, Vaclav. That talk was wonderful and insightful. You alluded to this notion of intervening in development. As you were talking about it, you mentioned colonialism, settler colonialism, and I was thinking about the idea of post-coloniality, and especially some of the folks who were interviewed talked about the young people in the next generation have to take over. And so there's this notion of this new world globalism that, the liberal notion of development and of these companies and these corporations and these institutions connecting different parts of the world. And I think this mining company is an instance of that. How do you see the ways in which the non-indigenous people of Guatemala and the other institutions play a role in this, right? What do they have to say about it? I'm curious.
I think it's part of the hegemonic governance project in post-war Guatemala to sort of embrace neoliberal reform and understand that these foreign direct investment is going to come in one way or the other. Extractive practices is one of them. So they're really sort of looking forward for the GDP to grow because there's more sort of investment in the country. And it's the impact in the community is an afterthought. And that's what happens, in my view, when you have a society that doesn't want to look back into the past. or like an urban Ladino middle class society that wants to just move forward and it's worried about their own pocket and what they're going to be eating. Guatemala is still very dangerous, even for non-indigenous people. So that's why it's kind of a day-to-day struggle to memorialize the past. It's still quite insurgent to talk about genocide and to acknowledge that the genocide occurred in Guatemala. Even though around the world everyone knows, in Guatemala it's very hermetic. Everyone wants to be quiet and silence that past. So when you have that as a sort of backdrop, thinking about development in terms of an economic or a monetary gain becomes sort of the easiest thing to pursue. So I think the question that you're asking is sort of the subtext is, how do you build solidarity after times? Well, that's the $1 million question. And I think, but I think, to stay true to my pitch, I think it is through testimonies and it's through the public visibility of the struggle and how people have been able to overcome even the most unthinkable challenges, even the most insurmountable sort of challenge that you might face. You can still go. You're still going. And I think that's inspiring for anyone, to be able to know that you can rebuild your life and continue to be militant for social justice, even in the face of exclusion. That was originally my puzzle, and now it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have to continue organizing because the alternative...
Thank you so much, Vaclav. I would a little bit disagree that the rest of the world knows about Guatemala, because when some years ago we did this conference on Guatemala and I asked for grants to kind of co-sponsor or sponsor the conference. It was peer-reviewed. There were 3 peer reviews, 2 were excellent, and 1 was saying there was no genocide in Guatemala. This is academia in the US, yeah. So I would want to be too optimistic about what the rest of the world knows. I think there's still a lot more to do, and I think you are part of this to kind of educate also the Western world about what happened in Guatemala. This leads me to another question. So when you put this timeline, and there's colonialism, and then you end with extractivism. We had this conference in October with indigenous scholars, and some of them mentioned that for them, and not only at this conference, but this is more a common ground, that there is no post-colonialism for them. So I wonder what your stance is, because you could actually say the timeline is colonialism, but there are certain subdivisions of it which are different. And my own work, when I did work on the discrimination against indigenous people in Bolivia, I made the same, now looking backwards, the same mistake, talking about post-colonial Bolivia after they kind of gained independence from the Spanish crown, but the practices are colonial. And so I wonder what your elaboration is on this. And then one practical question about the testimonies. Most what you cited referred to violence or military. Did you come across some kind of comparisons, for example, the pollution of the water, which you mentioned in the very beginning, with, for example, the pollution of the wells by putting bodies of murdered after the massacres, or the burning of the crops of villages during the genocide?
Yeah. Let me start with the second question. I did find references in the testimonies that spoke about the scorched earth counterinsurgency campaigns. And they provided very detailed timeline of how the army would do these types of things. And essentially would compile everyone in the community outside, and then they first would destroy their livelihood. They would chop down all the milpa, all their corn that they would have, and burn their houses down, execute all the livestock, and then they would come for them. So it was a very sort of explicit and visceral way of telling them that they were being exterminated. And I think that's the contemporary iteration is a little bit more insidious, right? Like, you don't have to tell them what you're doing. You're just disposing all the mine tailings into the lake that serves as a livelihood. In a way, you're poisoning a community without necessarily having to tell them. And it fulfills the ultimate purpose, which is to render the land inhospitable for people, but very productive for industry. And the first question about the different temporalities. Yes, I think colonialism as a project, or in the US settler colonialism as a process, it's sort of the easiest concept to frame all these different incursions into indigenous territory. But for me, dividing it into these subcategories makes it more compelling to historians, sociologists, anthropologists, people in the social sciences, because it goes with how the nation state has evolved. Originally, it was conceived, indigenous bodies were conceived as labor, or rather as non-humans, then as labor during the plantation economy, and then as people, again, that had to be getting rid of. Now it's again in the background. So colonialism, as I wouldn't say what the mining company is doing is colonialism, although some people might argue. I prefer the more sort of concrete historical grounding to different iterations rather than just one main one.
So we have about 5 minutes left for questions.
Okay. We have a couple questions, but I'm actually going to jump down to Maria from another question because it segues really well with I think this conversation already. Asking about because I appreciated how you used Giovanni Batz's framework of the foreign nations, considering resilience and colonialism in Guatemala that keeps reinventing itself. What understandings does your research suggest might be the next invasion, and how do you struggle against it?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I really don't know. I still believe that we're in that fourth invasion of extractivism. I can't conceive a different project. I mean, right now, my main concern with Guatemala is that given that we're in an electoral year in 2023 and June is the first round, that the democratic backsliding that we're experiencing will actually become authoritarianism. And the front runner in the elections right now is the daughter of Efraín Ríos Montt, who was convicted for genocide. So I wouldn't be surprised if the practices of counterinsurgency and tactics would emerge again against people who, like the Defensoría Quechí, oppose development, right? Like, I'm sure that there is a fifth invasion that might come, but I don't know if it's gonna be a different dynamic. I would imagine that it would be more like what we saw in the 80s, which is quite concerning.
First, I want to say thank you for your presentation. I thought it was great, and Sarah, who had to go, they told me to extend the thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I had 2 questions. So the first one was, so you showed instances of when they were talking about violence, and something that stood out for me was someone in the interviews mentioned that his heart hurt. And I was just wondering if in your analysis of the interviews you took into consideration also how the way that they were expressing themselves or what questions may have prompted those responses. And then my second question was, I was wondering if this activism in relation to the mines has been able to create a pathway for memory activism in relation to the genocide, for people to push for being, hey, no, this has to be remembered. Thank you so much.
Yeah, start with the second question. Yes, I think the idea behind linking current extractive processes to the genocide is very clear, and it's beneficial for the movement to talk about political violence as a legacy, right? We experienced it 30 years ago, but now, even though it might not look the same, we're still being dispossessed. And the way that we fight it is the same, right? We build alliances, we try to create a coalition, we gain adherence, and I think memory work, the way that you frame things by looking at the past but putting it in a very present tense moment, is very useful. And then the first question regarding the emotional reaction, totally. I mean, the way that I was able to code these interviews was almost line by line. I first had to do everything in Spanish, and then each almost sentence or a couple of sentences, I would code it. I would be like, this is about when they were growing up. This is about when they were in school, or this is about when they were working, when they were first fell in love. And through those codes, I was able to sort of filter in and out those expressive instances where I think memory work also implies a lot of emotion work. Remembering is hard, and sometimes memories are not clear. So yeah, even the way that you enunciate is important, I think. Like the person who was talking about the time that he was fumigating house against malaria, his demeanor, the way that he said it, I think is also very powerful, right? You can't just take the text. It's good that we have a visual history too, because you can get the feeling as well by seeing it. So yeah, I took that into account, totally.
Well, thank you so much, Vaclav. That was amazing.